Back in the winter of 1878, the wind on the high plains west of the Divide was a constant, mournful thing. It found every crack, every seam, every weakness, and worried at it. It sculpted the snowdrifts into sharp, unforgiving shapes and bit at exposed skin like a pack of hungry wolves. It was the kind of wind that burrowed deep into your bones and settled there, a permanent ache. Garrett Calloway knew that ache well. It had been his companion for 2 years now, ever since Sarah died. His cabin was a small, sturdy box against the vast, indifferent landscape, huddled near the slow-moving, ice-rimmed river that was his only neighbor for miles. He had built it with Sarah, piece by piece, a monument to a future they had planned but never saw. Now, it was just a box, filled with the ghosts of laughter and a silence that pressed down heavier than any mountain snow. He lived a life stripped bare, a routine dictated by necessity, tending the few head of cattle he managed, chopping wood, hunting sparingly, always just enough to keep the gnawing hunger at bay. There was no joy in it, no forward movement, only endurance. Garrett was a man shaped by hard country and harder loss. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, perpetually distant. He moved with a quiet economy, each motion deliberate, conserving energy in a world that offered little in return. He was in his early 30s, but the lines around his eyes and mouth spoke of a man who had lived decades longer, carrying a weight that bent the shoulders of his youth. The river, frozen mostly now save for a dark, murmuring ribbon in the center, was his closest friend, its steady flow a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil he held inside. He walked its banks sometimes, not looking for anything in particular, just walking, putting miles between himself and the four walls that held too many memories. His loneliness was a physical presence, sitting with him by the fire, sharing his meager meals. It wasn't just the absence of Sarah, though that was the gaping chasm at the center of his life. It was a deeper isolation, a sense of being utterly alone in the world, cut off from connection, from the easy companionship others seemed to find. He had come west chasing a dream of land and independence, but it had delivered only solitude and sorrow. He had seen the small, clustered settlements, the tentative towns springing up, but they felt alien, full of noise and expectations he couldn't meet, full of people who had not known Sarah, who did not carry the same particular brand of emptiness he did. So he stayed by the river, where the wind and the silence were at least honest. He was checking his traps one morning, the frigid air biting at his cheeks, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the frozen earth and the distant moan of the wind. He followed the riverbank, scanning for tracks, for any sign of game. That was when he saw it, a dark shape against the snow, nestled amongst the bare willows at the water's edge. It was too still to be an animal, too irregular to be a fallen branch. Caution, honed by years on the frontier, stiffened his back. He approached slowly, hand near the rifle slung over his shoulder. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself into a human form, small, huddled, wrapped in a few layers of worn hides and cloth. And then he saw the hand, dark-skinned against the white snow, clutching at a bleeding wound high on the arm. It was a woman, a native woman. His breath caught, not just from the shock of finding someone here, but from the implications. Native people rarely came this far west, not openly. The settlements had pushed them back, fractured their bands. To find one alone, wounded, in this desolate place, it spoke of trouble. His first instinct, the one the frontier had taught him, was to retreat, to avoid entanglement. This was not his fight, this was not his problem. But the woman stirred, a weak groan escaping her lips. Her head lifted slightly, revealing a face, drawn and pale despite the deep brown of her skin. Her eyes, dark and clouded with pain and fear, met his. In that instant, the vast, impersonal landscape seemed to recede. There was only the wounded woman, the chilling wind, and the stark, undeniable fact of her suffering. It bypassed his caution, his weariness, his ingrained isolation. It pricked something deep within him, a buried ember of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Responsibility? Compassion? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't turn away. He knelt beside her, careful not to appear threatening. Her breath was shallow, ragged. The wound looked bad, a tear in the flesh, still weeping crimson onto the frozen ground. He spoke softly, words he hoped were gentle, though he knew she likely wouldn't understand them. "Easy now, don't move, I won't hurt you." She flinched as he reached out a hand, but her strength was gone. He carefully peeled back the blood-soaked cloth from her arm. It looked like a bullet wound, grazed but deep. She must have been running. From what? From whom? He didn't ask, didn't need to. Trouble rode the wind out here like everything else. He knew he couldn't leave her, not like this. The cold would claim her within hours. He looked back towards his cabin, a lonely wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. It was warm there. It was safe, in its own empty way. Bringing her there was a risk, a big risk. He didn't know her, didn't know what trouble she carried, didn't know how the townsfolk would react if they ever found out he had harbored a native woman. Prejudice ran deep and cold in this land, colder than the winter air. But the look in her eyes was a silent plea, raw and desperate. It reminded him, with a jolt, of the vulnerability he had felt himself in the face of loss, the utter helplessness. He made his choice. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "All right, I'll take you to my place." Moving her was difficult. She was small, but weak and clearly in agony. He scooped her up gently, supporting her wounded arm. Her body was feather-light in his arms, frail as a bird. He turned from the river, from the biting wind, and began the slow, arduous trek back towards the cabin, his boots breaking the untouched snow, leaving the only tracks in the desolate white. The weight in his arms was unfamiliar, but it felt real, a counterweight to the pervasive emptiness. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of wood smoke and old coffee. He laid her carefully on the narrow cot by the fire, the one Sarah had slept on when she was ailing. He knelt beside her, gathering supplies, clean rags, water heated on the stove, a bottle of strong whiskey he kept for snakebite or pain. He worked slowly, methodically, cleaning the wound as best he could. She winced, whimpered softly, but did not cry out. Her jaw was set, her eyes squeezed shut. He poured a generous amount of whiskey over the wound, and she gasped, body tensing, but still, she made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. Resilience. He saw it in the rigid line of her body, the clench of her fists against the cot mattress. He tore strips of clean cloth and bandaged the wound tightly, his big hands surprisingly gentle. When he was finished, he stood back, looking down at her. She was still shivering, whether from cold, shock, or fear, he couldn't tell. He found a heavy wool blanket, one Sarah had woven, and spread it over her. "There," he said, his voice rough. "It's done. You're safe now." She didn't respond, her eyes still closed, her breathing evening out slightly. He sat on a stool across the room, watching her. The silence in the cabin, usually so empty, now felt different. Charged, full of the unspoken presence of the wounded woman, full of questions he couldn't ask, and a situation he didn't know how to handle. For the next few days, he moved around her like a ghost, quiet, observant. She slept a lot, drifting in and out of a restless slumber. When she was awake, she was watchful, her dark eyes following him, wary but without overt fear. He offered her water, broth he made from dried venison, small pieces of hardtack. She took them slowly, her movements hesitant, her gaze still assessing. Communication was almost non-existent. He tried a few simple words, pointing to the water skin, to the food. She nodded, or shook her head, her face a mask he couldn't read. He didn't know her name, her people, why she was alone and injured. He didn't push. There was time, he figured, if she survived. He changed her bandage daily, the wound slowly improving, the angry redness fading to a dull ache. Each time he touched her arm, he felt the delicate bone beneath the skin, the fragility of her body, a counterpoint to the quiet strength in her eyes. She never spoke, not a single word he understood, but there was a language in their shared existence now, in the small cabin. The crackle of the fire, the simmering of the broth, the quiet footsteps as he moved about his chores, the soft sound of her breathing from the cot. He caught himself watching her when she thought he wasn't looking, not in a prying way, but with a quiet curiosity. He noticed the intricate beadwork on her worn moccasins, the way her long, dark hair fanned out across the blanket, the fine, precise lines of her features. She was not like anyone he had ever known. Growing up back east, the native people were distant, often feared figures in stories. Out here, They were the savages the settlers warned about, the obstacle to progress. But looking at her, a vulnerable woman in his care, those ingrained prejudices felt hollow, meaningless. She was just a person in need, a person showing remarkable resilience. One afternoon, while he was mending a saddle by the fire, she surprised him. She had been sitting up, leaning against the wall, her good hand-tracing patterns on the blanket. Suddenly, she spoke. The words were soft, hesitant, in a language he didn't know, but the tone was clear: gratitude. He looked up, met her eyes, and smiled, a slow, rusty movement of his facial muscles that felt strange after so long. "You're welcome," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping the feeling translated. He gestured to her arm, then made a movement of getting better, giving a thumbs up. She watched him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, touching her own lips for the first time. Another day, he brought in fresh snow to melt for water. His hands were numb, clumsy. He dropped a chunk, and it scattered across the floor. She reached out her good hand, gesturing towards a scoop near the hearth. He nodded, realizing. Small things, but they were bridges. Later, she managed to sit up on the cot for longer periods. She watched him work, her gaze intelligent and observant. She seemed particularly interested when he worked with wood or leather. He found himself explaining what he was doing, talking about the wood grain, the stretch of the hide, simple things, just to break the silence, knowing she didn't understand the words, but maybe sensing the intent. One evening, as the firelight danced on the cabin walls, she spoke again. This time, she pointed to herself and said a word. "Nahili." He paused, understanding dawning. "Nahili," he repeated, testing the sound. It was soft, musical. He pointed to himself. "Garrett. My name is Garrett." "Nahili." She practiced his name, her tongue stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar sounds, but she got it, a small victory in the quiet cabin. "Garrett." Slowly, haltingly, a thread of communication began to weave between them. She pointed to things and spoke words in her language. He did the same in English: river, fire, wood, water, sky, deer, snow, cabin, small, foundational words, building a fragile, shared vocabulary. He learned that her people lived far to the west, that she had been separated from them, though the details remained a mystery. Her face would cloud over, her gaze turn inward, whenever he neared the subject of why she was alone and hurt. He didn't press. It was enough for now that she was here, healing. As Nahili grew stronger, she insisted on helping with chores. She couldn't use her wounded arm much yet, but she could feed the fire, sort dried beans, even, to his surprise, show him a better way to lash certain things together using strips of rawhide she somehow produced from her scant belongings. She had a quiet competence that impressed him. She moved with grace, despite the lingering weakness. Her presence filled the cabin in a way Sarah's absence had hollowed it out. It wasn't a replacement, nothing could be, but it was a presence nonetheless, warm and alive. The routine of his life shifted, subtly but significantly. He wasn't just enduring anymore. He was caring for someone, providing, protecting. It gave him a purpose beyond mere survival. He found himself anticipating her quiet company, the soft cadence of her voice when she spoke in her language, even though he understood little of it. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the heavy, empty silence of his grief. It was a shared silence, comfortable, watchful, occasionally punctuated by the small, halting steps of communication. Her wound healed slowly, leaving a puckered scar on her arm. As her physical strength returned, so did a deeper weariness in her eyes. She was safe for now, but for how long, and from what exactly? He still didn't know the full story, but he knew enough. She was here because she had nowhere else to go, or nowhere else she could go. One day, while they were collecting fallen branches near the riverbank, a rider appeared on the horizon. Garrett's body tensed instantly. He grabbed Nahili's arm, pulling her down behind a thicket of brush. They crouched low, watching as the rider approached, a solitary figure against the vast sky. It was Elias Thorne, a rancher from the nearest settlement, 50 miles east. Garrett knew him only by reputation. A hard, pragmatic man. Not openly hostile, but part of the world Garrett had withdrawn from. Thorne didn't often venture this far west. Garrett's gut tightened. Had he seen the smoke from the chimney and come to investigate? Had someone seen him with Nahili? Thorn rode up to the cabin, dismounted, and hailed the empty air. "Calloway, you home?" Garrett stayed hidden, urging Nahili to stay low. He didn't know what Thorn wanted, but revealing Nahili was a risk he wasn't willing to take without knowing the score. Thorn called out again. After a minute, he remounted, scanned the surrounding area, his gaze sweeping unnervingly close to their hiding place, and then turned his horse back the way he came. They stayed hidden until long after the rider had disappeared. When they finally emerged, Garrett felt a knot of fear in his stomach. Thorn's unexpected visit, coupled with Nahili's presence, felt like the calm before a storm. The isolation that had been Garrett's refuge now felt like a potential trap. He had thought he could hide away from the world, but the world, in various forms, had a way of finding you. That evening, by the fire, Garrett looked at Nahili. "Trouble," he said, using the word he had taught her. He pointed back the way Thorn had come. "Men, maybe looking for you." Nahili's eyes widened, fear flickering there, raw and unconcealed. She nodded slowly, understanding. She looked at her bandaged arm, then at the vast, empty landscape outside. There was no easy answer. The quiet truce of their shared existence was broken. A new tension entered the cabin, the knowledge that they were both vulnerable, both exposed. Garrett found himself looking at Nahili, not just as a guest or a responsibility, but as someone he was now bound to protect. His cabin, his solitary refuge, had become a sanctuary, and the lines between them, between host and guest, were blurring into something else, something he wasn't ready to name. Weeks turned into months. The deep winter began its slow retreat, though the cold remained a constant. Nahili was fully healed, her arm strong again. Their shared vocabulary had grown, a patchwork of English and her language, supplemented by gestures and context. He learned that her people called themselves the Dainay, that she had fled from a violent encounter with white men who had attacked her family. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press, the pain in her eyes enough of an explanation. She spoke of wide canyons and mesas, country far different from the high plains. She longed for her people, but feared the journey, feared being found again. He found himself sharing things too, small pieces of his life, his past. He spoke of Sarah, of the dream they had built here, of the emptiness that had followed. He showed Nahili a small, tarnished locket he kept, holding a miniature painting of Sarah's face. Nahili listened with a quiet attentiveness that was a balm to his still raw grief. She didn't offer platitudes or try to fix it. She simply listened, a silent witness to his pain. Their days fell into a rhythm. They worked together, seamlessly. Nahili was surprisingly adept at ranch tasks, her knowledge of the land and animals seemingly innate. She taught him how to forage for certain plants that could be eaten or used for medicine, showed him tracking signs he had never noticed, shared stories of her people through broken language and expressive gestures. He taught her more English words, how to handle a rifle, though she seemed wary of it, how to mend fences. The isolation was still present, geographically, but the loneliness within the cabin was receding, replaced by a quiet companionship, a mutual reliance that felt stronger than friendship, not yet love, but something deep and necessary. The fear of being discovered was a constant undercurrent. Garrett avoided the settlement completely now, trading sparingly with a lone trapper he sometimes encountered further north. He was careful about smoke, about tracks, constantly scanning the horizon. He knew that if the wrong people found out about Nahili, the consequences could be severe for both of them. The prejudice against native people was fierce and unforgiving, fueled by fear and greed for land. Their bond deepened in quiet ways, a shared look over the dinner table, a comfortable silence by the fire, a hand offered to help over a rocky patch on the riverbank. He found himself protecting her instinctively, not just from external threats, but from the harshness of the life, trying to shield her from the biting wind, making sure she had the warmest blanket. And she, in turn, seemed to watch out for him, her quiet presence, a grounding force against the pull of his old sorrow. She saw his moods, his moments of deep reflection, and offered solace not in words, but in simply being there. One crisp spring morning, as the snow was melting and the river swelled, 3 riders appeared on the eastern ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. Garrett saw them instantly. They weren't locals, he knew. They had the look of men who traveled hard and fast, men with a purpose. His blood ran cold. He grabbed Nahili, pulling her back towards the cabin. "Trackers," he breathed, the word needing no translation in the sudden urgency. "They found you." Fear, sharp and visceral, seized Nahili, but it was quickly replaced by a grim determination. They had talked about this possibility. She knew the cabin was exposed. "River," she said, pointing west, towards the rocky, difficult terrain on the other side of the water, a place only foot travel or experienced horsemen would attempt. Garrett nodded. Escape was the only option. There was no fighting 3 armed men, not here, not with Nahili vulnerable. He grabbed rifles, ammunition, a blanket, some dried meat, and a water skin. "Go," he urged, pushing her towards the back of the cabin. As the riders spurred their horses down the slope towards his land, Garrett opened the back door. "Across the river, hide in the rocks." Nahili didn't hesitate. She slipped out, moving fast towards the sound of the rushing water. Garrett watched her go for a second, then slammed the door shut and grabbed his primary rifle, positioning himself by the front window. He had to buy her time. The riders reached the cabin, pulling their horses to a skidding halt. The leader, a burly man with a scarred face, dismounted first, his hand on his pistol. "Calloway," the man shouted, his voice raw and demanding. "We know you got her. Hand over the squaw." The word was a slap, igniting a cold fury in Garrett's gut. "She ain't here," Garrett called back, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Don't lie to us, Calloway. We tracked her to this river. She didn't cross. She's in there." Garrett raised his rifle, aiming for the ground near the scarred man's feet. He fired. The shot echoed across the valley, sharp and final. Dust and gravel kicked up around the man's boots. "Get off my land," Garrett said, his voice low and dangerous. "She ain't here, and even if she was, you ain't taking her." The scarred man's face twisted with rage. "You protecting a savage? You're as bad as they are." He drew his pistol. "We can take her, and your cabin." The other 2 men dismounted, spreading out. Garrett knew this was it. He was alone, outnumbered. But the thought of Nahili, fleeing into the unforgiving terrain across the river, of these men catching her, he couldn't let it happen. He ducked back from the window as shots rang out, splintering the wood around him. He scrambled to the back door, peering out. He could see Nahili, a small figure already halfway across the swollen, fast-flowing river, picking her way precariously across submerged rocks and using fallen logs for balance. The cold water surged around her. She was risking everything. He had to create a distraction. He ran back to the front, kicked open the door, and sprinted towards his small corral where his horse was kept. He drew their fire, drawing their attention away from the river. Bullets whizzed past him, tearing at his clothes, thudding into the fence posts. He reached the corral, fumbled with the latch, and slapped his horse on the flank, sending the animal galloping away from the cabin, further distracting the trackers. He dove behind a stack of firewood as more shots peppered the wood. The scarred man and his companions were advancing towards the cabin, confident they could flush him out or burn him down. He had one more play. He scrambled around the back of the woodpile, keeping low. He had barrels of water and sand kept near the cabin for fire emergencies, but he also had lamp oil. A dangerous, desperate idea formed. As the trackers neared the front door, yelling for him to come out, Garrett risked a dash to the side of the cabin to where the oil was stored. He grabbed a can, ripped it open, and flung the contents towards the side of the cabin and the ground directly in front of it, splashing it wide. "You want the squaw?" he yelled. "Come get her." He dove back behind the woodpile as one of the men lobbed a burning torch towards the cabin. It landed right where Garrett had thrown the oil. Flames erupted instantly, roaring up the side of the cabin wall, spreading rapidly across the ground towards the front door. The trackers cursed, scrambling back from the sudden inferno. The wind, his old enemy, was now, for the moment, his ally, fanning the flames towards the attackers and away from where he had poured the oil. This was his chance. While they were distracted by the fire and the heat, Garrett bolted from cover, rifle in hand, not towards the burning cabin, but towards the river. He didn't look back, didn't know if they were shooting at him or trying to save their horses from the heat. His only thought was reaching Nahili. He reached the riverbank, the cold water shocking his legs through his trousers. He waded in, the current stronger than it looked, pulling at him. The rocks were slippery, the water icy. He stumbled, righted himself, pushing on. He could see Nahili ahead, struggling up the far bank, soaked but safe from the immediate threat. He finally reached the other side, breathless and shivering. He scrambled up the bank, collapsing beside Nahili amongst the sheltering rocks. They huddled together, watching as smoke billowed from the direction of his cabin. He couldn't tell if it was burning to the ground or if the trackers were managing to put it out. But it didn't matter, not really. His home, the physical manifestation of his grief and isolation, was gone or compromised. He had traded it for a chance at safety, for Nahili's safety. The scarred man's angry shouts carried across the river, distorted by the wind and distance. They cursed him, yelled threats, but they didn't attempt to cross the treacherous water after them. Not yet, anyway. They spent the rest of the day and the night hidden in the rocks, cold, hungry, and exposed. The bond between them, forged in quiet companionship, was solidified by shared danger. They were outcasts together now, their fates intertwined. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised colors, Garrett looked at Nahili. Her face was smudged with dirt, her clothes torn, but her eyes met his, clear and resolute. "Gone," he said, gesturing back towards the distant smoke. "Cabin." Nahili nodded. "My people," she said, pointing west. "We go." Going west meant a long, dangerous journey through unfamiliar territory, potentially encountering others who would be hostile. But going east, back towards the settlements and the trackers, was impossible. And staying here, exposed, was just waiting for the next threat. West was the only way forward. "Yes," Garrett said, the word a commitment, a promise. "We go, your people." They started west that morning, two solitary figures on the vast, silent land. They had only what Garrett had grabbed: the rifles, some ammunition, a blanket, dried meat, water. It was a meager start for a long journey, but they had something more valuable now: each other. The journey was brutal. They navigated rough terrain, crossed icy streams, endured hunger and exhaustion. But they did it together. Nahili's knowledge of the land was invaluable. She found shelter, identified edible plants, read the signs of the wilderness. Garrett's strength and skills with the rifle kept them fed and offered protection. They were a unit, two halves making a stronger whole. They spoke more now, the necessity of survival breaking down the last barriers. He learned more about her life, the richness of her culture, the tragedy that had driven her from her home. She learned about his life, his dreams, the depth of his loss. They shared stories around meager campfires, the flames pushing back the vast darkness and the ghosts of their pasts. Prejudice wasn't just an external threat. They saw it in the wary, hostile stares of the few white travelers they encountered, who sometimes muttered curses or clutched their weapons tighter. It was a constant reminder of the world they were outside of, the world that would judge and reject them. But their shared experience, their reliance on each other, made those judgments feel distant, less important than the bond they had built. The journey wasn't about finding a physical home as much as it was about building a new one within each other. The vast landscape, once a symbol of Garrett's isolation, became the testing ground for their connection. They faced challenges together: a flash flood, a near miss with a grizzly bear, days without finding game. Each obstacle overcome strengthened their trust, their mutual respect. They were no longer just a wounded woman and the man who found her. They were Nahili and Garrett, traveling together, bound by circumstance, choice, and a quiet, growing affection that had bloomed unexpectedly from the desolate soil of their shared hardship. After weeks of arduous travel, guided by Nahili's sense of direction and the sun, they began to see signs of her people, faint tracks, specific markings on trees. Hope, a fragile thing Garrett had buried with Sarah, stirred within him. For Nahili, the signs brought a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Would her people accept him, a white man? One evening, as they crested a rise, they saw it. Smoke rising in the distance, more than a single campfire. A camp. Her people. Nahili let out a soft cry, a mix of relief and trepidation. Garrett felt a similar mix. His journey with Nahili might be ending, or it might be entering a new, unpredictable phase. He had faced down trackers and fire, but facing a whole community, one that had every reason to distrust a white man, felt like a different kind of challenge. They approached the camp cautiously the next morning. A group of men, alerted by their sentries, met them some distance away. The air was thick with tension. Nahili stepped forward, speaking rapidly in her language. gesturing towards Garrett, explaining her story. The men watched Garrett with stoic faces, their eyes assessing, wary. He stood tall, unarmed, letting Nahili speak for them both, a silent testament to his reliance on her, to his peaceful intentions. There was a long discussion, questions posed to Nahili, sidelong glances at Garrett. He understood none of the words, but he felt the weight of their scrutiny, the history of conflict and betrayal that stood between him and these people. Finally, an elder, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face, stepped forward. He looked at Nahili, then at Garrett. He spoke slowly, deliberately, in a few halting words of English. "She says, you saved her life, you protect, you good man." It wasn't a full acceptance, not yet, but it was an opening. Nahili's return, her story, and Garrett's presence beside her spoke volumes. He had come not as a conqueror or a threat, but as a companion, her protector. They were allowed into the camp. Nahili was reunited with her family, the scene a mix of tears and joyful embraces that Garrett watched from a respectful distance. He felt a pang of his own loneliness, seeing such deep familial connection, but it was tempered by the quiet pride of having helped bring her home. He spent the next few days in the camp, a guest, an anomaly. The children were curious, the men watchful, the women reserved. He helped where he could, splitting wood, fetching water, using the universal language of useful work. He didn't try to force acceptance, just existed quietly, letting his actions speak louder than words. He and Nahili were still together, sharing meals, spending time by the fire, their bond now visible to everyone. The scarred man and his companions didn't follow them this far west. The threat from that direction seemed to have receded. But the world outside the Dine camp was still a dangerous place, full of prejudice and uncertainty. One evening, under a vast, star-filled sky that felt immense and humbling, Garrett sat by a fire with Nahili and her family. The elder who had spoken to him before sat across from him. "Garrett," the elder said, using his name, "you came far. You have no home?" Garrett thought of the burned cabin, the empty plains. "No," he said, the words simple and true. "My home was gone." The elder nodded, his eyes understanding. "Nahili says, you have good heart. You saved her." He paused, looking around at the community, the families gathered, the circle of warmth against the cold night. "This is her home. Her people." He looked back at Garrett. "But home can be where heart is, where people care." Garrett looked at Nahili, sitting beside him, her hand resting near his on the blanket. She looked serene, safe among her people, but her gaze met his, a silent question and a deep connection passing between them. He had come west chasing a dream, lost it, and found only solitude and grief. He had stumbled upon a wounded stranger, a woman from a world utterly alien to his own, and in protecting her, in journeying with her, he had inadvertently found something he hadn't been looking for. A purpose beyond himself, a connection that transcended fear and prejudice, and the possibility of a home not built of wood and stone, but of shared resilience, mutual care, and the quiet strength of a bond forged in hardship. He didn't know what the future held. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the challenges of two different worlds meeting. But sitting there by the fire, with Nahili beside him and the cautious acceptance of her people surrounding them, Garrett Calloway, the grieving, isolated cowboy, felt a warmth bloom in the place where the ache of loneliness had resided for so long. He had come seeking land and independence, but he had found, unexpectedly, the seeds of belonging. And in the quiet presence of the woman he had carried from the riverbank, he felt, for the first time in years, the fragile, precious stirrings of hope, like a seed pushing through the frozen earth, reaching for the sun,